The article of the Augsburg Confession today is on the marriage of priests, which is one of the longer articles, probably because the Lutherans at the time needed to explain themselves, because this was a huge point of contention with the Roman Church. So this is some background and details as far as what that was all about. So here's the Augsburg Confession. We'll just start reading the first paragraph. There has been common complaint concerning the examples of priests who were not chaste. For that reason also Pope Pius is reported to have said that there were certain causes why marriage was taken away from priests, but that there were far weightier ones why it ought to be given back. So Tina writes. So there is no question that the priesthood, the Roman priesthood, has always had issues. The lack of chasteness among priests goes back, to the early centuries, and not just chasteness because they weren't married, but chasteness even as married priests very early on cheating on their wives. It's even said that in the early centuries, homosexuality among priests was an issue, as it is, of course, in our day, which is a huge issue in our day. But the confessions cite all the way back earlier how the priests had a reputation for being adulterous. So that's one of the reasons they say, well, maybe kind of putting the best construction on the situation, maybe that's why the Pope took away marriage from priests, because they weren't behaving very well. They were bad examples of morality, so he just forced them into this chastity to try and refrain their sexual behavior.
Yeah, see what that did for them.
Pardon?
We can see what that did for them.
Yeah, we can see how well that worked out. There is a note there, see notes section 1. So if you look to section 1, which is on page 2, under notes, here is a brief history when they talk about how, this has been an issue in the past and popes in the past had to deal with it. Here's a history of how this was dealt with and when it was dealt with. So the first official action by the church to insist on celibacy evidently traced back to 306, the Council of Elvira. So instead insisted that bishops, presbyters, deacons, and all other clerics should abstain completely from their wives and not have children. So this wasn't just celibacy, don't get married. Even if you're married as a priest at this time, you were supposed to be celibate from your wife and not have children. This council stated openly that clergy who were married were bound by a vow of perpetual continence, meaning no sexual relations with one's wife. No woman was to be kept in the clergy's living quarters with the exception of a mother or sister or aunt or a person who was above suspicion. Well, actually, even though this shows that they were trying to force celibacy, it also shows that they had married clergy. So the argument cannot be made by Rome, which they do try and make, that the early church, already from the beginning and the apostles on, refused to allow priests to marry. They obviously did. The issue was, evidently, they had a problem even with having relations while you were married. The next one, Council of Nicaea, from which we get the Nicene Creed, by the way, called by Emperor Constantine 325, argued for a consistent practice of priestly celibacy. This, however, was voted down at the conclusion of the council. So it was an issue there, but they did not go along with it. So there was no forced celibacy at this time, which is only 20 years later, from the Council of Elvira. The Quinsext Council, 692, essentially formalized this difference and set out what continues to be Eastern Orthodox practice to this day. Married men may be ordained as deacons and priests after their marriage. However, men who are ordained before marriage may never do so, and bishops are chosen from the ranks of celibate clergy. So yeah, in Orthodoxy, you may be married as long as you got married before you became a priest. And if you are married, you can never advance in the church's hierarchy. You can never become a bishop or anything above that. You will always forever just be a priest in a parish.
It's also interesting that that's starting to be the practice in the Roman Catholic Church.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. All right. Next one, Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches formally divided in AD 1053, which coincided with a period of reforms in the Roman Church known as the Gregorian Reforms. In connection with his attempt to establish papal supremacy, Pope Gregory VII took up a campaign against married clergy. In 1074, he issued a papal encyclical essentially stripping episcopal authority from bishops who allowed priests to marry. The next year, he issued a decree depriving married priests of their incomes. While these papal actions initially met with significant opposition, they ultimately were successful. So, about 500 years, less than 500 years before the Reformation, it was becoming forced now at this point. It wasn't just statements saying priests shouldn't. There was actually punishments being associated with any priests that were married and bishops who married them. Yeah, deprive you of your income. Basically force you out of the priesthood. Next page, AD 1095, Pope Urban II had priests' wives sold into slavery and children were abandoned. So they continued to be married through all this time, but the popes kept inflicting more and more harm on married priests, and now even on their wives. 1123, at the First Lateran Council, the bishops issued a severe edict concerning clerical celibacy. Peter de Rosa describes it. 1,000 prelates decreed that clerical marriages should be broken up and spouses made to do penance because these marriages were invalid. 1139, Pope Innocent II at the Second Lateran Council confirmed the previous council's decree. And now this is after the Augsburg Confession. 1045-63, Council of Trent stated that celibacy and virginity were superior to marriage. So there is a long history of the Roman Church attacking the idea of priests being married and trying to force in varying degrees the celibacy thing, to the point where in the centuries prior to the Reformation they were actually breaking up any marriages that existed, cutting off salaries, selling wives into slavery. It was truly a harsh and wicked thing. But that marriage thing never went away.
And what was the motivation?
We will get to that. Yes, we will address why they felt it necessary. Kind of.
My seat.
Yes.
Just glad I'm Lutheran.
Yeah. You would be sold into slavery right now. All right,
Good
second.
cook, so she can bring high dollars.
Yeah.
She also does housework.
Well, what a bonus, huh? Yeah.
Do I hear a bid?
It's going to be a long ride home. Multiple bedrooms in our house.
Yeah.
It's going to be a quiet ride home.
The short answer to your question, though, why did they do it, before we get to it in more detail, is what they say is the belief that a priest is married to the church, and that has to be your first love, so to speak. You have to devote all your attention to the church, and if you're married, you can't. So that I think is their main argument for why the celibacy. All right, second paragraph. Since, therefore, our priests, Lutheran priests, were desirous to avoid, back on page 1, desirous to avoid these open scandals, they married wives, and taught that it was lawful for them to contract matrimony. First, because Paul says, 1 Corinthians 7, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. Also, it's better to marry than burn. Secondly, Christ says, Matthew 19:11, all men cannot receive this saying, where he teaches that not all men are fit to lead a single life, for God created man for procreation, Genesis 1. Nor is it in man's power, without a singular gift and work of God, to alter this creation. For it is manifest, and many have confessed, that no good, honest, chaste life, no Christian, sincere, upright conduct has resulted from the attempt, but a horrible and fearful unrest and torment of conscience has been felt by many until the end. Therefore, those who are not fit to lead a single life ought to contract matrimony. For no man's law, no vow, can annul the commandment and ordinance of God. For these reasons, the priests teach that it is lawful for them to marry wives. It is also evident that in the ancient church, priests were married men. For Paul says, 1 Timothy 3, that a bishop should be chosen who is the husband of one wife. And in Germany, 400 years ago, for the first time, the priests were violently compelled to lead a single life, who indeed offered such resistance that the Archbishop of Mainz, when about to publish the Pope's decree concerning this matter, was almost killed in the tumult raised by enraged priests. And that probably is a reference back to that citation of how they tried to force the selling of the priests' wives into slavery and, jettisoning your children and families and everything. All right, so another pause at this point. There was reference, and we'll get to this at the end, a reference to yet another issue tied up in this marriage of priests thing. And that is keeping of vows. Because all of these priests had already made vows of celibacy, and now to get married, they were breaking their holy oaths to God. Is that justified or not? We'll talk about that at the end. But they cite several scriptural passages here worth considering. So if you look at section 2 of notes on page 3, the biblical case against forced celibacy, these are the passages quoted by the confessions, at least the Augsburg Confession. So 1 Corinthians 7, they quote verse 2 and 9. I've copied you the entire verse sections 1 through 9. So let's just read that. Now concerning the things of which you wrote me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself. But each one has his own gift from God, one in this matter and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it's better to marry than burn with passion. All right. So Paul makes it quite clear that he is not married and is celibate at this point. I've read things that suggest maybe at one point in time Paul was married and he was widowed. I don't think there's any evidence of whether he was ever married or not. But clearly, as an apostle, he is unmarried. Things to note from this section, the asterisks. Sexual relations are for marriage alone, obviously. Either marry, it's better to marry than burn with passion. Now, if you can't exercise self-control, get married. Sexual relations between husband and wife are to curb lusts. Better to marry again than burn with passion. It's marriage is for that, in part. Next, they are to be mutual benefit, not selfish. Actually, this is, in my book I note, this is kind of a radical passage in a lot of ways, concerning both among the Romans and the Jews at this point. Women were really considered unequal to the men. And women were to do what they were told. And this was true in the bedroom as well as anywhere else. Women were objects in a lot of ways, especially the more secularized society. Paul comes along here now and really gives men and women equal expectations when it comes to sexual relations. Let the husband render to the wife an affection due her. Likewise, the wife to the husband. So the wife is due affection. The wife doesn't have authority over her body, the husband does. Every Roman and Jew would agree with that, but the next sentence they wouldn't. Likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. It's unheard of in those days. So this is restoring a level of respect and equal expectation in the sexual relation for husband and wife that no other religion on earth offered. Judaism certainly didn't. The Roman paganism didn't. Christianity does. Next point, celibacy is a gift from God, verse 7. I wish all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift. It is a gift very few men have. And the other point, lack of sex drive is not a sin, nor is it homosexuality. In our day, kids are told if they don't have a almost overactive hyper sex drive that they must be homosexual. There's never even a consideration that maybe they just don't have a sex drive or don't have a very strong sex drive. Scripture recognizes the fact that not having a strong sex drive is not a sin. Not getting married is not a sin. You don't have to have strong desire for the opposite sex, and that doesn't mean you're homosexual if you don't. Here, Paul calls it a gift. Why? Why would that be a gift, to not be attracted to the opposite sex? Or at least not want to be married to the opposite sex? What's that?
I'm not answering that.
Why would that be a gift? Well, what about Rome's claim that if you're not married, you can devote your time fully to the church? And you're actually kind of married to the church. In fact, calling the priest father is part of that whole philosophy. He's the head of a home. The home is the church. So, in that sense, maybe there's some truth in that. Especially for the apostles. And we'll come back to this later. But the apostles especially had good reason not to get married. We know Peter was married. We don't know about the other apostles. The claim by Rome is none of the other ones were married. Nobody knows that. But if you grant them that and you say they weren't married, maybe there's a reason for that. And the apostles, more than others, would have that reason, because every last one of them except John would be martyred. And I think they knew it. They knew that was coming. They knew that their life was going to be a hard, miserable life, on the road all the time, being beat up, going with very little. How could they support a family, being devoted to a life like that? So in that sense, celibacy for them was a gift. Because if they had families, their families would be suffering like they were. So I think that's why Paul would call it a gift. My old Greek professor in college, Walter Jenrick, we always made fun of him for the way he dressed because he was single and would wear stripes and checks and, things that didn't match, colors that didn't match. And we laughed about it. Asked him once, he invited us over to his house, asked him once why he never got married. And he said he was engaged. And it came down to a choice for him between Greek or a wife. Devote himself fully to his Greek studies or have a wife. And he knew if he was married, he could not devote himself to Greek like he wanted to. So he broke off the engagement and chose Greek. And was very content throughout his life with that decision. So for some men, it's a gift, and he did not need that to feel complete. And God directed him towards becoming a Greek teacher. He taught a lot of pastors. But that ain't for everybody. All right. So marriage is for all those who do not have the gift of celibacy. And he's like the only guy I know who who really was content and didn't have any other issues because of a choice of celibacy. I knew another professor who was also never married, but he wound up getting into trouble for his lack of celibacy. All right, first of all, any comments, any thoughts on 1 Corinthians 7 before we move along? All right, Matthew 19, another verse quoted. The Pharisees also came to him. They quote only verse 11. I'll read 3 through 12. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" He answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" He said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." His disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man and with his wife, it's better not to marry." But he said to them, "All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it." This is a fascinating section on a number of levels. One, understand the debate they're trying to drag Jesus into. There were two main schools of divorce among the Jewish rabbis in Jesus' day. One school said that a man could divorce his wife for virtually any reason. No-fault divorce. And by the way, women could not divorce their men. This was strictly a male thing. Men could divorce their wives for virtually any reason. Another school said, no, a man can only divorce his wife if she commits adultery on him. There was a third, lesser school that said a man can divorce his wife if he finds another woman who's more attractive, basically, that he likes better. And then on top of that whole mess is the whole Jewish thing of levirate marriage, which says a man can have more than one wife. So marriage was a disaster among the Jews. In fact, polygamy was a given among the Jews. It's just understood. And the Jewish Mishnah goes as far as to say that if a woman does not give a man a son within the first 10 years of marriage, he has to take a second wife to try and have a son. Now for the Jews, they had that whole tribal thing where they had to trace their ancestry down, and the line of Judah carried the Messianic line, so they had to trace it all, so it was a big deal to have sons. But yeah, polygamy was common, divorce was common. And then the way divorce happened was absurd. All a guy had to do is write on a piece of paper, "I divorce you." Have two witnesses sign it, hand it to her, the marriage is done. Just like that. And she's out on the street. There's no court to go to split up the stuff. She's out on the street with nothing. And that was going on regularly. So when they come to Jesus and they say this question, can a man divorce his wife for just any reason? They're trying to drag him into this war between the two schools. One saying, yes, he can divorce for any reason. The other one saying, no, only for adultery. Jesus sides with the school that says only adultery. But he doesn't really side with them because he goes back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis 1 with what God made marriage to be and not taking allowances for sin. God in the beginning made them male and female and said for this reason, So Jesus doesn't give in to them and take the bait with this. So on the asterisks underneath the quotation, Jesus takes the question of divorce back to marriage as God designed it at the beginning. That is, he doesn't make allowances for sin or the fall. Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of hearts and sin. You know, Moses was a man who spoke with God face to face, the only man ever to speak with God face to face. Moses wasn't just acting because he was a weak man. He wasn't. Somehow or another, God allowed this to happen with Moses, to write certificate of divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. And maybe it comes down to, you know, sometimes every pastor I know deals with the same thing. What's the lesser sin? It almost becomes a game of what's the lesser sin. Force two people to stay together who hate each other's guts and sin every day against the other because they hate each other so much. Or simply allow them to commit another sin and divorce even though they don't have strong biblical grounds for it. It's like no matter what the decision is, there's sin involved. So which is going to be the worse? And I think that's probably the situation Moses found himself in. He ultimately permitted divorce because in those instances, if he would not, the sin would wind up growing and becoming greater. Third asterisk, Jesus allows divorce here only because of cheating on one's spouse. And then, by the way, the innocent party may pursue the divorce. The disciples raised the question of celibacy because of the difficulty maintaining marriage as God ordained it in Eden. Then this bit about the eunuchs at the end in verse 12. There's three classes of eunuch. A eunuch was someone who was castrated, someone who did not have an active sex drive, a strong sex drive. Eunuchs did, however, often marry after their term of service as a eunuch, especially royal eunuchs. They married, they of course couldn't have children, but they could marry, and evidently they had a sex drive, it was just repressed. So what about eunuchs? There's three classes made by men. Eunuchs made by men, eunuchs born that way, and eunuchs who chose that way for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So let's start with the made by men eunuchs. That's the easiest. A eunuch made by men, back in those days, castration was a common practice, especially among a male servant who was being charged with caring for the female family members. And among royalty, especially the keepers of the harems, they were castrated so that they did not have, the same temptation to commit adultery as others might. That was common for Roman slave owners to have those slaves in his group that would be castrated. So this was a common practice. They also in Rome castrated men for perverse reasons, because they had a fascination with young, hairless male bodies, perverse fascination, pederasty. And so by castrating someone before puberty, they were able to extend that period of time before that person entered puberty and keep them younger much longer for their own sick reasons. So eunuchs were all over the place in this culture at the time, made by men. What about the other one, the eunuchs who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake? What's that talking about?
That must be the gift Paul was talking about.
Exactly. That's not physical castration. That's simply a willingness to be celibate and an ability to be celibate, a gift to be celibate, where you are setting aside your sex drive for the sake of serving the church. There have been in history those church leaders called church fathers, one in particular, who took this verse quite literally and castrated himself. Origen. I guess he went to a doctor and had a doctor do it, but nonetheless was castrated physically, but that is not what Jesus is talking about here. What about the eunuchs born that way? And this is the one I find the most interesting. What about a eunuch born that way from his mother's womb? The old, argument in our day, you're born that way. It's a strange time for a bell. There is some truth to this, born that way. Jesus allows it. Are you born that way? Well, being a eunuch from birth, the way that Luther understood this, which I don't think I agree with, the way he understood it is this is a reference to a birth defect of some sort that would affect males and make it so that they're not able to have children or simply have no sex drive. So the original thinking back in the day was this is a reference to a birth defect. You're born with something wrong. I don't think it has to be that. We've already established it doesn't have to be a physical problem because you've got the eunuchs who choose to be eunuchs. That's not talking about physical castration. That's talking about simple will. So it doesn't have to be a physical issue even when it comes to those born that way. It can simply be there are some people born who do not have a very strong sex drive. They don't desire the opposite sex. They don't want to have marriage. They have no interest in girls growing up. There are people like that, and it's not wrong. It's not sinful, and it doesn't mean that person is homosexual. They are asexual. They don't have a sex drive. That's okay. Nothing wrong with that. But our world, of course, anybody who doesn't have that hyper-dominant alpha male type sex drive is labeled as, well, you must have leanings towards homosexuality. Scripture allows for not having that alpha male sex drive. It is not sinful and it's not homosexuality. All right, so how this plugs in again to the whole argument. Jesus, too, when he's talking about celibacy in the clergy, or anybody, it's not just clergy here, it's somebody who wants to serve the church. He's talking about it as a unique thing, perhaps even a rare thing, especially with the statement at the end, he who is able to accept it, let him accept it. Jesus acknowledges there will be those who are not able to accept it. And it is not a disqualification from any service in the church if you don't accept it. All right, any other thoughts on that passage before we move to the Genesis 1? All right, Genesis 1 also quoted. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over every living thing that moves on the earth. Okay. I think that this image of God thing, I think it's tied to gender. The way the Catechism deals with this is the image of God is perfect knowledge of God, and a will that wants to follow God's will. So it's harmony with God in knowledge and will. And faith, perfect understanding of God. That's kind of the way the Catechism deals with it. But this, I think, goes beyond just that. He created man in his own image. That's a general term for people. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. The text specifically mentions the male and the female thing as part of the creation of the image of God. That man and woman, each according to their genders, reflect something of the image of God, unique. So, both sexes are the image of God, and yet they are unique in their expression of that image. I think especially in our gender-confused world, that's something that needs to be explored more. The first commandment God gives these two genders is to be fruitful and multiply, procreation. So again, God commands procreation. It is not sinful or wrong or anything like that for husbands and wives to procreate. Yet Rome makes it that way. Any thoughts there? All right, next one. I think that passage is quoted a little... Nope, it is quoted before that. Okay, so 1 Timothy 3, the marriage of pastors. So this is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, or not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and snare of the devil. Are you under proper submission, Gabe? Are you under, with all reverence? Of course he is. Or else. Yeah. So. All right. So, Timothy clearly acknowledges the fact that bishops, which is their word for pastor, should be married even. Must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded. The vast majority would be married. And the word bishop they use there is from the word episcopus, which, you know, we have the same word in our language with episcopal. Overseer, supervisor, ruler, especially used with reference to supervising function exercised by an elder or presbyter of a church or congregation, a pastor. So whoever desires to be a pastor, those are the qualifications. So how Rome can come along again and say that from biblical times it was forbidden for priests to be married is just absurd. Not only can he be married, top of page 5, but he needs to be a good father to his children. So unlike Rome's decrees, it is not a Platonic marriage being described, but one that produces children. All right. Now, the next verse we will get to later, because it's quoted in a later paragraph in the Confessions. Any thoughts thus far on anything we've discussed? All right, pressing on then. Back to page 1, second paragraph from the bottom, Augsburg Confession. And so harsh was the dealing in the matter that not only were marriages forbidden for the future, but also existing marriages were torn asunder, contrary to all laws, divine and human, contrary even to the canons themselves, made not only by the popes, but by most celebrated synods. Moreover, many God-fearing and intelligent people in high station are known frequently to have expressed misgivings that such enforced celibacy and depriving men of marriage, which God himself has instituted and left free to men, has never produced any good results, but has brought on many great and evil vices and much iniquity. Yeah. There were credible reports of, especially in the nunneries, of nuns being impregnated by priests, and places of where babies were being either killed by infanticide or abortion, where the nuns would bury the bodies. And prostitution among priests. There were actually priestly prostitutes. So this stuff was all known. And that's what they're talking about with brought forth many great and evil vices and much iniquity. What an example for the people. Seeing also that as the world is aging, man's nature is gradually growing weaker. It is well to guard that no more vices steal into Germany. Furthermore, God ordained marriage to be a help against human infirmity. The canons themselves say that the old rigor ought now and then in latter times to be relaxed because of the weakness of men, which it is to be wished were done also in this matter. And it is to be expected that the churches shall at some time lack pastors, if marriage is any longer forbidden. That was a prophetic statement, that last sentence, because right now Rome is in big trouble finding enough priests to fill pulpits. All right. Next page. What's that? You've had a chance to have 3. Yes, that's right. You got pastors coming out of your ears. All right, top of next page. But while the commandment of God is in force, while the custom of the church is well known, while impure celibacy causes many scandals, adulteries, and other crimes deserving the punishment of just magistrates, it is a marvelous thing that in nothing is more cruelty exercised than against the marriage of priests. Yet Rome right now, and not really just right now, but even there are references to this even in the early centuries, has a problem with homosexuality among the priesthood. In fact, there was just, and this isn't a homosexual thing, but there was just a thing a month ago about a priest I think in Florida, being arrested for having sex with 2 prostitutes on the altar in church. Did you see that? I must only be the one that gets that news, but yeah, but the homosexuality thing especially. There are all kinds of studies that have been done. Just how high is the homosexual rate among the priests? There have been studies within the Roman Church itself that place the level at about 20%. That's their own estimate. And I've heard that a more realistic estimate is like 40% or higher. Homosexuality is a huge issue in the Roman Church. And this current pope is part of the problem. He's just issued statements saying that it's okay for having same-sex unions now. That the government should provide same-sex unions. So
It makes you wonder why he's saying that.
I know it does, and it's well known. In fact, was it 2 years ago where one of the higher up, a cardinal, I don't remember his exact position, but in Rome itself, wrote a scathing attack on the current pope for his pro-homosexual agenda and the way he was elevating priests who were known to be homosexual, elevating them into positions of leadership. That's been brushed under the carpet and completely ignored, even though this guy had all the facts, dates, times when all of this stuff was happening, who it was happening, who they had relationships. He had them nailed with it, and they totally ignored it all. So this is a huge problem in Rome right now, this homosexual thing. And it is related to forced celibacy. Because who are you going to get in the priesthood other than men who aren't interested in women, in relationships with women? And your options are either guys that have this unique gift of celibacy, which is an extremely rare gift, or guys that have no interest in women because they're interested in men. And that's where Rome is at right now. Next paragraph. God has given commandment to honor marriage by the laws of all well-ordered commonwealths. Even among the heathens, marriage is most highly honored. But now men, and that priests, are cruelly put to death, contrary to the intent of the canons, for no other cause than marriage. Paul in 1 Timothy 4:3 calls that a doctrine of devils which forbids marriage. This may now be readily understood when the law against marriage is maintained by such penalties. But as no law of man can annul the commandment of God, so neither can it be done by any vow. All right. So the verse they're citing is the very end of section 2 notes on page 5. We'll look at that verse. 1 Timothy 4, 1-3. Now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. So Paul to Timothy warns of doctrines of demons which forbid marriage. How that can't be applied to this, I don't know. But anyway, the Lutherans do apply this to the Roman issue. And I think it well so. Last paragraph now of the Augsburg Confession, back to page 2. Last paragraph. Accordingly, Cyprian also advises that women who do not keep the chastity they have promised should marry. His words are these, but if they be unwilling or unable to persevere, it is better for them to marry than to fall into the fire by their lusts. They should certainly give no offense to their brethren and sisters. And even the canons, again, those are the laws, church laws, show some leniency toward those who have taken vows before the proper age, as heretofore has generally been the case. Okay, so this is the other issue now tied into the celibacy thing, the vows issue. These people have made promises to be celibate, and they are breaking these holy promises to God. Is that justified or not? See page 5, section 3 on vows. So, what about that? Do we have the right to break promises we have made to God? Should we break promises we have made to God? The Lutherans said, yes, if those promises were out of line with God's will in the first place. If they were wrong promises, if they were promises based on sin, not on God's will, or went contrary to God's will, then absolutely we should break those promises because they are not in line with God's will in the first place. So that was the Lutheran argument. And I think it's valid. I think it's true. Why would we hold to something that's contrary to God's will just because in a moment of stupidity we made a promise? You've got the weird example in the Old Testament of a promise made that was just, contrary to God's will, frankly, and stupid, of Jephthah. So for the sake of time, I won't read it all. But you can if you want on your own. So yeah, the Jephthah guy promises God, look, you let me win this battle. The first thing that comes out of my house, I'll offer it to you as a burnt offering. What kind of a stupid promise is that? The first thing that comes out of my house, I'm going to offer it to you. What do you think is going to come out of your house? Do you have goats living in your house? So he goes home, and what comes out of his house? First thing, his daughter. Anybody could have seen that coming, evidently, but Jephthah. So now here he is. I made a promise to God to offer up whatever comes out of my house. What am I going to do? His promise was for a burnt offering. But it seems to take a little turn here towards the end of the story because the daughter, first of all, runs up to Dad, all excited, hasn't seen Dad forever, and Dad is very sad. Daughter says, why are you so sad? Because I just made a stupid promise. Explain the promise. The daughter says, look, Dad, you made a promise to God. We got to keep it. She was a phenomenal believer. But the way they keep it does not seem to be the burnt offering thing. It seems as if they changed it. He didn't follow through on the vow as he made it. Because frankly, it would have been sinful if he had. God does not accept human sacrifice. That is paganism. It's sinful. Even if you vow to do it, it's wrong. So it seems as though the way that the solution they came up with was to alter the vow somewhat. So look in verse 36 there of the handout. So she, that is the daughter, said, my father, if you have given your word to the Lord, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, because the Lord has avenged you of your enemies and the people of Ammon. Then she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Let me alone for 2 months, that I may go and wander on the mountain and bewail my virginity, my friends and I. So he said, go, and sent her away for 2 months, and she went out with her friends and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. And it was so at the end of 2 months that she returned to her father, and he carried out his vow with her which he had vowed. She knew no man. Now, did he carry out the vow by burning her alive or killing her as a burnt offering? Or is that last sentence the way they carried out the vow? She knew no man. And what she was mourning on the mountain was not her life, but her virginity. So it seems as though their solution to this, we just made that vow wasn't right, wasn't pleasing to God, was instead of the burnt offering, she simply was committed to a life of celibacy. So sorry about that. So she couldn't have children or anything. And he lost out on grandchildren and all that. So that's what they did with a vow, it seems. So there is actually biblical precedent for not following through on a vow that's contrary to God's will. All right, we got to stop. Let's close with a prayer. Gracious Father, we pray for your blessings this day and always. Grant us your grace and give us stronger faith that we may persist in this world true to you, regardless of the sins the world is forcing on us. In Jesus' name, amen.